A renomada ganhadora do Prêmio Nobel questiona publicamente o jovem presidente burkinense Ibrahim Traoré durante uma conferência internacional. Diante das câmeras e de uma plateia mundial, sua tentativa de corrigir seu ponto de vista se transforma em um momento inesperado de humildade, reflexão e admiração, graças à resposta calma, fundamentada e firme de Traoré. O episódio desencadeia uma série de eventos que expõem as tensões entre perspectivas ocidentais e africanas sobre soberania, justiça social e autodeterminação. The African Continental Forum on Development and Sovereignty was not like other conferences. This was not about press releases and networking cocktails. It was raw, politically tense, and framed around a single theme: reclaiming African autonomy in global politics. In Ouagadougou, the announcement stirred excitement and controversy. President Ibrahim Traoré, known for his unfiltered views and revolutionary leadership, had been invited as a keynote speaker. His attendance sent a message. Burkina Faso was not afraid to speak truth to power. Across the Atlantic, Dr. Marianne Leclerc, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and a revered humanitarian from France, also confirmed her presence. For over 3 decades, she had worked in Africa, leading initiatives in refugee aid and education. Many admired her, others whispered that she represented the very paternalism the continent was trying to shed. The world would be watching. 2 symbols, 2 ideologies, were about to share the same stage. Accra's International Conference Hall was filled with anticipation. Delegates from 54 African countries and several Western nations sat side by side under soft lights and silent tension. Traoré arrived in his characteristic style: military uniform, calm eyes, no entourage. He shook hands politely but avoided small talk. Dr. Leclerc, in a linen suit and ivory necklace gifted by Maasai elders, carried the gravitas of global recognition. She walked with the confidence of someone used to respect, to admiration. But this was not Geneva. This was not a room she controlled. The panel discussion began with pleasantries and rehearsed optimism. But when Traoré was asked what Africa needed most from the international community, he didn't hesitate. "We don't need help," he said slowly, in French. "We need space. We need respect. We need the right to fail and rise on our own terms." Murmurs rippled through the room. Leclerc leaned into her microphone. "Mr. President, while I admire your courage, I fear such rhetoric dismisses the realities on the ground. Burkina Faso still receives humanitarian assistance. Are you saying that aid is unwelcome?" Her voice was measured but sharp. Traoré didn't flinch. He folded his hands on the table and looked directly at her. "I am saying," he replied, "that aid which comes with conditions is not help. It is a leash, and we cannot run free while tied to someone else's vision of our future." Silence. The moderator cleared his throat nervously. The room was holding its breath. Outside the conference, Accra's streets buzzed with life. Women balancing basins of oranges on their heads, young men weaving through traffic on motorcycles, the scent of charcoal-grilled tilapia floating in the air. Inside, a moment had crystallized, one that would soon spread across social media, screens, and living rooms around the world. Clips of Traoré's statement flooded Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. Some hailed him as a voice of a new Africa, unapologetic, assertive, dignified. Others accused him of arrogance, of rejecting lifelines for the sake of pride. But the most surprising shift came not online, but within Dr. Leclerc herself. That night, in her hotel room overlooking the city skyline, she replayed the exchange, over and over, not out of defensiveness, but discomfort. A discomfort that gnawed at something old, something buried. Her first years in the field, when she had believed that aid could be transformative. Before bureaucracy, before compromise. She realized she had stopped listening long ago. The next morning, before the second day of the conference, Dr. Leclerc requested a private audience with President Traoré. The meeting took place in a modest room away from the cameras, no staff, no translators, just two people and a pot of strong black tea. Traoré, calm and alert, waited. Leclerc began. "I came to apologize, not because of how people reacted, but because I heard your words." Truly, only later. Traoré didn't respond immediately. He poured tea into 2 ceramic cups, then spoke. "I wasn't offended. I was used to that question. What mattered was the room, the people watching. They needed to see that disagreement can be strength, not weakness." Leclerc nodded. "Do you think I have been part of the problem?" He took a long sip of tea. "I think we are all born into a story someone else wrote, but we can choose whether to keep repeating it or rewrite it." The two sat in silence for several moments, not out of awkwardness but respect. Something shifted. News outlets across Africa replayed the moment again and again. Traoré's calm words, the weight of his silence, the look on Leclerc's face. In Burkina Faso, radio shows lit up with callers voicing pride. "He spoke like our father would," said one woman from Bobo Dioulasso. Firm, but never disrespectful. In Europe, the reactions were more mixed. Some politicians called Traoré dangerously idealistic. Others, particularly younger voices, applauded his refusal to be patronized. But behind the headlines, something deeper was happening. In universities across Dakar, Nairobi, Bamako, and even Paris, students began debating aid, sovereignty, and narrative power. Professors adjusted syllabi, podcasts were launched, hashtags like "Africa on its own terms" trended globally, and in Leclerc's inbox, messages poured in. Some praised her humility for apologizing, others criticized her for giving, but none were indifferent. The world was listening now, and neither of them could take back what had been said. Leclerc returned to France, but her mind remained in Africa. She opened an old leather journal from her first mission to Rwanda in 1995. The pages were worn, ink smudged with time. She had written once, "I came here to help, but I see now I am learning more than I give. They do not need saviors, they need allies." She had forgotten that girl, forgotten what humility had once meant to her. She stood at her apartment window in Lyon, watching the Rhône River flow like history, sometimes slow, sometimes violent. And she realized Ibrahim Traoré hadn't humiliated her. He had reminded her of who she once was, and still could be. That night, she began drafting something, not a press release, but a letter. The open letter was published 3 days later in Le Monde and then translated across dozens of platforms. To the people of Africa, and especially to President Ibrahim Traoré. You reminded me that dignity cannot be outsourced and that partnership begins with listening, not leading. I came to the stage armed with my accolades, but you stood there armed only with truth. And it was enough. It was more than enough. The letter went viral. In Burkina Faso, street murals of Traoré appeared overnight. In Lagos, an editorial praised the new diplomacy of honesty. In Johannesburg, a university dean called it a milestone in post-colonial dialogue. But perhaps most powerful was a quiet moment in a classroom in Ouagadougou, where a teenage girl named Awa stood up after reading the letter aloud and said, "I didn't know people like us could make the world listen." Back home, Traoré walked through a crowded market without bodyguards, something few presidents in the world dared do. He shook hands, smiled, bought oranges from an old woman who refused to take his money. The vendors didn't speak to him like a politician. They spoke to him like a brother. In a dusty courtyard, students held an impromptu debate circle. Their topic? Is sovereignty more valuable than foreign investment? No professor had told them to do it. They did it because the world was finally echoing their questions. Meanwhile, in a radio studio downtown, two musicians recorded a protest song inspired by Traoré's speech. Its chorus said, "We are not weak, we were waiting for the mic." 6 months later, something unexpected happened. A joint announcement from the office of the President of Burkina Faso and the Marianne Leclerc Foundation. They were co-founding the Sahel Sovereignty Institute, a research and policy center led by African scholars, funded transparently with no conditions. It would train future leaders, study development strategies designed by Africans, and serve as a platform for fair international dialogue. The global response was skeptical at first, but then the board was revealed. Young economists from Mali, agronomists from Niger, feminist scholars from Senegal. It wasn't a think tank for show, it was real. And at the launch, Traoré said only this: "We are not rejecting help. We are rejecting hierarchy." Leclerc sat beside him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Years later, the story of that conference is taught in political science courses around the world. Not because of scandal or sensationalism, but because of something rare: transformation through dignity. Ibrahim Traoré continued to lead with integrity, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, but never silenced. Dr. Leclerc shifted her foundation's focus toward supporting locally designed initiatives. She stepped out of the spotlight, but her influence remained. And in Burkina Faso, a new generation grew up seeing themselves not as recipients, but as architects of change. In an interview long after her retirement, Leclerc was asked what changed her most. She smiled and said, "A quiet voice, a steady gaze, and the question, are we helping people to stand or teaching them to kneel?" The interviewer sat in silence. Sometimes it takes only one calm reply to change the world. But inside the country, something else was happening. Local NGOs were filling the gap, with support from the Sovereignty Institute and diaspora funding. In a village near Kaya, a health clinic was built with no outside funding. The nurse said, on a live stream, "We are not rejecting help, we are reclaiming trust." Rumors spread that France had approached a former Burkinabe general in exile, urging him to challenge Traoré's leadership. A leaked voice note confirmed the conspiracy. Traoré addressed it in a national broadcast. "They will not send tanks. They will send confusion. They will make us fight each other. We must not give them that victory." The people understood. The general never returned. In a surprising move, Halimatu Doumbia was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, backed by African universities and grassroots movements. Leclerc, now working in a quiet advisory role, refused to comment publicly. But, privately, she sent Halimatu a letter. "The future is yours. The silence around you is just fear waiting to be transformed." Within Traoré's own administration, cracks began to show. Some ministers pushed for reopening negotiations with Western donors. Traoré refused, saying, "We cannot build a new house with bricks from the old empire." 2 ministers resigned. The media called it a fracture. Traoré called it necessary pruning. His popularity wavered, but his vision remained intact. An extremist attack near Fada Ngourma shook the nation. Dozens died. International voices said, "See, they can't do it alone." But instead of panic, a movement formed. Civilians, ex-soldiers and volunteers organized their own security network. With coordination, training and local intelligence, they pushed back. The West remained skeptical. But the ground reality was shifting. At the age of 72, Leclerc gave one final public speech at a university in Nairobi. Her voice was weaker, but her words were clearer than ever. To fix the world, we must first unlearn how we were taught to save it. Sometimes the best thing a Nobel laureate can do is listen, and then step aside. She passed away quietly, 2 months later. Her funeral was held in both France and Burkina Faso. Traoré attended both. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger signed a pact: mutual protection, shared development, no foreign military bases. The world reacted with shock. The UN called it bold. NATO called it worrying. But in the dusty markets of Ouagadougou, people simply called it ours. It was the first time in modern history that 3 landlocked nations stood together, not as allies of the West or East, but as architects of their own path. 5 years after that fateful conference, a high school student in Ouagadougou published an essay, "The Day My Country Answered Back." It was about the Traoré-Leclerc exchange, not the politics, but the feeling of being seen. The essay won an African Youth Literature Prize, and when asked why she wrote it, she said, "Because I want my daughter to read it one day and know we didn't stay quiet." Years had passed. Ibrahim Traoré no longer held formal office. He had chosen to step down after his second term, refusing calls to amend the constitution. "Power," he once said, "should never become comfort." He returned to his modest home outside Ouagadougou, living simply, refusing personal security unless necessary. He had become a symbol, yes, but more importantly, he had become a story. Across Africa, his name was mentioned not with idolization, but with recognition. People didn't say, "He saved us." They said, "He reminded us that we could save ourselves." In classrooms from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, students still analyzed the exchange between him and Leclerc, not as a clash, but as a convergence. A moment when truth and humility met halfway. And in the final interview of his life, recorded by a young Burkinabe journalist, Traoré was asked, "Do you believe the world truly changed?" He paused for a long time. "No, the world doesn't change," he said softly. "People change, and then they change the world." The camera kept rolling. The silence afterward was not empty. It was full of memory, of purpose, of the kind of hope that is earned, not imagined.